Look, I need to talk to you about something that's going to fundamentally reshape American society over the next decade. This isn't hyperbole. This is pattern recognition based on decades of studying global macro trends, demographic shifts, and capital flows. America has a structural real estate problem that most people don't fully understand yet, and the implications are going to touch every aspect of economic life, whether you own property, whether you're trying to buy, whether you're renting, whether you're investing. I'm Raoul Pal, and I've spent my career analyzing systemic risks and structural imbalances in economies around the world. I've watched housing crises unfold in multiple countries. I've studied what happens when affordability breaks down and when entire generations get priced out of asset ownership, and what I'm seeing in the US right now is a setup that should concern everyone, regardless of where you are in the wealth spectrum. Before we dive into the data and the implications, hit that subscribe button, because the analysis I'm about to share connects housing, monetary policy, wealth inequality, and demographic trends in ways that mainstream commentary completely misses. If you want to understand the forces reshaping the economy, you need to be here. Let me start with the macro framework, because nothing happens in isolation. The US housing market is experiencing something unprecedented: a simultaneous supply crisis, an affordability crisis, and a financialization crisis. These three forces are converging to create what I believe will be one of the defining economic issues of this decade. First, let's talk about the numbers, because the data is undeniable. The median home price in America is now roughly 7x median household income. Historically, that ratio has been around 3-4x. In the 1970s, it was closer to 2.5x. This isn't just a marginal increase, this is a structural decoupling of housing prices from income fundamentals. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that a household earning the median income of around $75,000 is looking at median home prices of $420,000 after putting down $20,000, which requires $84,000 in cash that most people don't have. Their financing $336,000 at current mortgage rates of 7%. That's a monthly payment of roughly $2,200, not including property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. That's over 35% of gross income just for the mortgage payment. By traditional lending standards, housing costs should be no more than 28-30 of gross income. We've blown past that threshold for the median household. This isn't sustainable mathematics. Something has to give. Either prices have to come down significantly, incomes have to rise dramatically, or rates have to fall, and I don't see any of those three things happening in the near term. Now let's talk about supply, because this is where the structural problem becomes clear. The US has been underbuilding housing for over a decade. After the 2008 financial crisis, construction collapsed and never fully recovered. Builders went bankrupt, financing dried up, and we lost an entire generation of construction capacity. Current estimates suggest we're short anywhere from 3 to 5 million housing units relative to household formation. That is not a small gap, that is a structural deficit that would take years of above-trend building to resolve. And we're not building at that pace. In fact, we're building at roughly the pace of household formation, which means we're not closing the gap at all. We're treading water while the problem compounds. Why aren't we building more? Because the economics don't work for builders to create affordable housing. The cost of land has skyrocketed in the markets where people want to live. Labor costs have increased substantially. Construction wages are up 30-40 since 2019. Material costs have been volatile and elevated, regulatory costs and permitting timelines add enormous expense and delay. So what do builders do? They focus on the high end of the market where margins are better. They're building luxury condos, $800,000 single-family homes, properties targeting the top 20% of income earners. Because that's where they can make money. The result is that new supply is concentrated in segments that do end to address the affordability crisis for the median household. Now let's layer on the interest rate shock. For over a decade, we had mortgage rates at historic lows: 2, 5, 3%, 3.5%. That created two effects. First, it pulled forward demand. People who could afford to buy at those rates rushed into the market, driving up prices. Second, it locked in a massive cohort of existing homeowners who now have no incentive to sell. If you bought or refinanced in 2022-2021 and you're sitting on a 3% mortgage, why would you sell? If you sell and buy another house, you're going from a 3% mortgage to a 7% mortgage. Even if you're moving to the exact same house, your monthly payment nearly doubles. So people are staying put, which is removing inventory from the market right when we need more supply, not less. This creates what's called a lock-in effect. And it's brutal for market functioning. Mobility freezes. People who would normally upgrade or downsize or relocate for work are stuck. And first-time buyers who are trying to enter the market face even less inventory competing with investors who can pay cash, which brings me to the financialization problem, the third leg of this crisis. Institutional capital has flooded into residential real estate over the last decade. Private equity firms, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, publicly traded REITs, they have all decided that single-family homes and small multifamily properties are an asset class to own at scale. Why? Because in a world of zero interest rates and central bank money printing, they needed yield. Residential real estate offers rental income, inflation protection, and leverage opportunities, so they deployed billions of dollars buying properties by the thousands. And here's the thing, they have structural advantages over individual buyers. They can pay cash, which makes them more attractive to sellers. They can close quickly. They can overpay on individual properties because they're building a portfolio, not buying a place to live. They have access to capital at rates individuals can't get. And they are playing a long-term game where they don't need to liquidate quickly if the market turns. This has created a dual market. There's the market for owner-occupants, and there's the market for investors, and increasingly investors are winning. In some markets, 20-30 of single-family home purchases are by investors, not people who plan to live in them. In certain neighborhoods, that number approaches 50%. What does this do? It removes properties from the ownership market and converts them into permanent rentals. It drives up prices because investors can outbid families, and it changes the character of communities. When half the neighborhood is rentals, you lose stability, you lose the investment that homeowners make in their communities, you lose the social cohesion that comes from having people with long-term stakes in the area. Now, I'm not anti-investor, I'm a professional investor, I understand capital allocation. But when institutional capital at scale distorts a market that's fundamental to middle-class wealth building, we have to acknowledge that's creating structural problems beyond just individual transaction dynamics. Let me zoom out and talk about what this means for wealth inequality, because this is where the macro implications become really troubling. For the American middle class, home equity has historically been the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation. The median American household has roughly 60-70 of their net worth in home equity. For families in the middle of the wealth distribution, it's often their only significant asset. When you price an entire generation out of homeownership, you're not just affecting their housing situation, you're fundamentally altering their ability to build wealth. And it's compounding. The people who already own homes, predominantly older generations who bought when prices were lower, are seeing their wealth increase through appreciation. The people locked out of ownership, predominantly younger generations, are seeing their wealth stagnate or decline in real terms because they're pouring money into rent rather than building equity. This creates a wealth divergence that gets worse over time. The gap between homeowners and renters in terms of net worth is already massive and growing. And this has political implications, social implications, economic implications that go far beyond housing. From a demographic standpoint, this is also affecting family formation. When people can't afford to buy homes with enough space, they delay marriage, they delay having children, or they have fewer children than they'd prefer. Birth rates in the US are already below replacement levels, and when you ask young people why, financial insecurity and housing costs are consistently top answers. This isn't just a personal choice issue, this has massive economic implications. Fewer births means a smaller future workforce, which means less tax revenue, more pressure on social programs like Social Security and Medicare, slower economic growth. We're creating a demographic problem on top of a housing problem, and they're reinforcing each other. So what happens next? What's the path forward from here? Let me walk through the scenarios because this matters for how you position yourself. Scenario 1 is continued stress with slow resolution. Prices stay elevated, affordability remains terrible, and we muddle through with a generation of renters. Some supply gradually comes online, but not fast enough to materially change the dynamics. This is the new normal scenario where homeownership rates decline structurally, wealth inequality increases, and we accept that housing in America just costs more relative to income than it used to. Scenario 2 is a price correction. If we get a recession, if unemployment rises, if mortgage rates stay elevated and demand softens, prices could fall 15-20. This would help affordability somewhat, but it would also hurt existing homeowners, many of whom are middle-class families who would see their primary asset decline in value. It would also potentially freeze the market further as people go underwater on mortgages. Scenario 3 is policy intervention. Government gets serious about increasing supply through regulatory reform, infrastructure investment, and incentives for affordable housing construction. They also potentially limit institutional buying or create incentives for first-time homebuyers. This is the we actually solve the problem scenario, but it requires political will that I don't currently see. Scenario 4, which is less discussed but possible, is continued financialization, where housing increasingly becomes an asset class dominated by institutional owners and individual ownership declines toward European levels. In many European countries, home ownership rates are 50-60 compared to 65% in the US. Maybe that's where we are headed, a society where renting is the norm for a much larger portion of the population. Each of these scenarios has different investment implications. If you believe scenario 1 or 4, then owning residential real estate or REITs that own residential real estate is probably a good long-term position. You're betting on continued yield and appreciation in a supply-constrained market. If you believe scenario 2, you want to be cautious about residential exposure and maybe wait for better entry points. If you believe scenario 3, the dynamics could shift entirely based on policy. Personally, I think we're in scenario 1 trending towards scenario 4 unless we get meaningful policy intervention. The political economy of housing is such that existing homeowners who vote at higher rates benefit from restricted supply and rising prices. Local zoning boards are controlled by people who own property and don't want more development. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is a powerful force. So what do you do about this? How do you position yourself intelligently in this environment? If you're currently a renter hoping to buy, this is difficult advice, but here's my framework. First, run the math honestly. Compare the monthly cost of renting versus buying in your specific market, including all costs: mortgage, taxes, insurance, maintenance, HOA fees. If buying is 50% more expensive monthly than renting and you don't plan to stay in that location for at least 7 to 10 years, maybe renting makes more sense financially, even if it feels bad psychologically. Second, if you can buy and the math works even somewhat, do it. Not because I think home prices are going to keep soaring indefinitely, but because building some equity is better than building none. Even if prices stay flat or decline modestly, you're still building net worth through principal paydown, and you're locking in your housing cost rather than being subject to rent increases every year. Third, be geographically flexible if possible. The housing crisis is not uniform across the US. There are markets, often in the Southeast, parts of Texas, parts of the Midwest, where supply is better, prices are more reasonable, and affordability is still within reach. If remote work is an option for you, consider whether you need to be in a high-cost coastal market or whether you can access opportunity elsewhere. Fourth, consider alternative forms of housing. Maybe a condo or townhouse is more accessible than a single-family home. Maybe you start with a smaller place and upgrade later. The perfect shouldn't be the enemy of the good. Building equity in any property is better than waiting indefinitely for the perfect situation. If you're an existing homeowner, my advice is different. First, recognize that your home equity is probably the largest component of your net worth, and that concentration risk should be managed. Don't treat your house like an ATM by constantly pulling equity out. Don't over-leverage to buy investment properties unless you really understand real estate investing. Second, if you're sitting on a low mortgage rate, recognize that's a massive asset. A 3% mortgage in a 7% rate environment is worth a fortune in present value terms. Don't give that up lightly. If you need to move for work or family reasons, fine. But don't move just because you want a slightly bigger house. The transaction costs and the interest rate reset might not be worth it. Third, think about the long-term implications for your children or younger family members. If you are blocking new housing development in your community because you are worried about property values or neighborhood character, recognize that you're making it harder for the next generation to achieve what you achieved. Maybe we need to rethink that trade-off. If you're an investor trying to position capital in this environment, there are several approaches. Owning residential REITs or publicly traded homebuilders could be a way to gain exposure to the continued demand for housing without the operational headaches of being a landlord. These companies have scale, professional management, and access to capital markets. Alternatively, if you're comfortable with direct real estate investing, there are opportunities in secondary markets where fundamentals are better, but do your homework on local supply-demand dynamics, economic base, population growth, and rental markets. And recognize that being a landlord is a business with operational demands. It is not passive income in the way many people imagine. You could also look at this structurally and say, if housing is going to be structurally expensive and if people are going to struggle with affordability, what are the knock-on effects? Maybe companies that cater to renters, companies that provide services to people who can't afford homeownership, companies in the renter economy, maybe those are investment opportunities. Let me address the policy side, because some of you are probably wondering, can't the government fix this? And the answer is yes, but it requires political will that's very hard to generate. Here's what would actually help: zoning reform. We need to make it legal to build more housing in places where people want to live. That means allowing duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings in areas currently zoned only for single-family homes. That means reducing parking requirements. That means allowing higher density near transit. These reforms are happening in some places. Minneapolis, Oregon, California has made some changes, but it's slow and contentious, permitting reform. We need to streamline the process of getting approval to build. Environmental review should be thorough but not endless. Local opposition should be heard but not given absolute veto power. Some states are creating ministerial approval processes that bypass local discretion for certain types of housing that needs to expand infrastructure investment. We need to open up new areas for development by investing in roads, water systems, transit, schools, the public infrastructure that makes new communities viable. Private developers can't do this on their own. It requires public capital, and we've been underinvesting for decades. Tax policy. We could create stronger incentives for building affordable housing and disincentives for leaving properties vacant or using them purely for speculation. Some cities have vacancy taxes, some have transfer taxes on frequent flipping. We could expand those. Federal housing policy. We could increase funding for affordable housing programs, revive programs that subsidize first-time homebuyers, or create new mechanisms for shared equity homeownership where government or non-profits retain partial ownership to keep homes affordable long-term. But here's the political problem. Every one of these policies faces organized opposition. Existing homeowners don't want more supply because it might affect their property values. Investors don't want restrictions on their ability to buy. Developers don't want regulations even if they're pro-housing because they don't trust government. Progressives and conservatives disagree on whether markets or government should lead, so we're stuck in a political stalemate while the problem gets worse, and that's why I'm not optimistic about major policy intervention in the near term. It's going to take the problem becoming even more acute, becoming even more politically salient. Before we see meaningful action, let me close with this. The American housing crisis is a macro issue with massive implications. It's affecting wealth building, family formation, economic mobility, political stability, and social cohesion. It's not going away on its own. Market forces alone won't solve it because the incentives are misaligned. Policy could solve it, but we lack the political will. So as individuals, we need to navigate this environment intelligently. Make decisions based on your specific situation, not on general platitudes about the American dream. Run the numbers, be realistic about what you can afford. Don't stretch yourself to the breaking point trying to buy in a market that doesn't make sense. And if you're already a homeowner, recognize your good fortune and think about how we create a society where the next generation has similar opportunities. Because if we don't solve this, we are going to create a fundamentally different America, one where ownership is reserved for the already wealthy and everyone else is a permanent tenant. That's not the country I want to live in, and I don't think it's the country most Americans want either. If this analysis resonated, leave a comment and tell me what you're seeing in your local market. Are prices insane? Is inventory non-existent? Are investors dominating? I want to hear real data from real people in different parts of the country. Share this with anyone trying to navigate the housing market right now, and subscribe because we are going to keep tracking these macro trends that shape all of our economic lives. The housing crisis is here, it's real, and it's going to define the next decade of American economic life. Position yourself accordingly.